It's the on-track recap. I'm John Jackson, and joining me, as ever, former British F3 driver and motorsports expert at talkSPORT, Piers Pryor. And Piers, another race, another win for Oscar Piastri. My prediction, Mr. Gunther Steiner's prediction from last week when we spoke to him in Miami, it's going to come true. 3 wins already this season. He's the new champion, isn't he?
He's looking pretty good. It's too early to say. We've only had 5 races now. I don't think we can call champion yet. Max Verstappen's still kicking around, and Lando Norris only has had a couple of poor races, less than a quarter of the way into the championship. However, if Piastri keeps going the way he's going, it's hard to see past him for a champion. He's ticking a lot of boxes. We've seen that he's had the pace in the past in qualifying. Didn't quite have maybe the tired deg experience in previous seasons. We know he's got that now. There's been question marks about whether he can race Max Verstappen. Well, I think we've proved that this weekend. There's question marks whether he can handle the pressure of leading a race. Well, he did that this weekend. Not much more left that he could do. The only thing that is remains to be seen is whether he can keep and put a championship challenge together in Formula One. We know he did that in F3 and F2 in consecutive years, but Formula One's a kind of bit of a different kettle of fish.
Obviously, I was just trying to trigger you with the intro to the show today because I know there's 19 races left of the season. I'm not being stupid. Just for those people watching on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel, of course, you can listen to this show on talkSPORT 2 throughout the week and on the podcast network and also on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel. I'm sat in a corridor of the Renaissance Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada in the United States of America. And I have to say that obviously the Formula One has been here for a couple of years now. And I was recently this morning in Hollister, and they've got like one of these partnerships with Red Bull and McLaren, and they've got loads of Lando Norris stuff, no Oscar Piastri stuff to be seen. And I think they're going to have to change stuff soon because Oscar Piastri is becoming this breakout star, and he is showing for me that he's got the mettle, he's got the mentality to put up a stronger fight than Lando Norris. And we're going to get into this as the show goes on. Also, it is very funny to be here in Las Vegas and just see how Formula One is everywhere now, even down to Max Verstappen advertising Red Bull cans in the supermarket down the strip, to where were we earlier? We were doing something earlier. Oh yeah, it was the Hard Rock Cafe. They've got a link up with Formula One as well. I think it's with Red Bull, isn't it? And they've got all their merchandise in there as well. So it feels like you can't go anywhere now without seeing Formula One, and it's going to be the 3rd year this coming year, and I think we've had a couple of good races here in Las Vegas, so that's why I look like I'm sitting in a corridor, because I am, if you're watching on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel. Now, the big talking point that's come out of this race is, of course, the Max Verstappen penalty. You're a former driver, Piers. Talk me through this penalty. Was it judged correctly by the FIA?
It's such a difficult one because I've got 2 sides. I think the directive that the stewards and the race directors in Formula One have been working towards is who's ahead at the apex. But I don't necessarily agree with the who's ahead at the apex and can do whatever they want on corner exit situation, because it's fine on a lot of grade 1 Formula One circuits, a lot of the circuits that we have nowadays. We've got ample runoff that we saw Max Verstappen use. But let's change that situation. What was if it was at turn 1 at, say, Baku or Monaco? Verstappen put himself in a position where if there was a wall where the white line was, he would have just driven himself straight into the wall. But then there's also the argument that Piastri didn't give him any space to go anywhere. So I can kind of see both sides of the argument. I think for me, Max Verstappen keeps doing it. He's shown it time and time again. If he's not going to lead into a corner, he just decides to not use the racetrack and drives off and takes the position regardless, and then puts it in the hands of the stewards to say, make a decision. Personally, I don't like that. I think it would be much better for him as a driver and for as a spectacle if we saw everything being decided on circuit. Max Verstappen has so much skill. We know how well he can overtake. We've seen it many, many times before. Well, I don't know why he doesn't just, for example, relinquish the corner into turn 1, slot in behind, and then have a DRS pass later in the race where there's no chance of him receiving a 5-second penalty. And ultimately, that's what cost him today. We saw once Piastri got in the lead, Verstappen couldn't stay with him in the dirty air. And if he'd have had a chance on that one to be within a second of DRS, or at least stay within a second for the next 2 laps until DRS opened on the middle of lap 2, then we could have had an epic race for the lead, and then who knows what the result could have been. But again, for me, it's another example of Max Verstappen just pushing the limit and a bit more. Whether it was correct or not, I can't say, because it's not my job to be a race director or a steward. I've never been in that position. You know, we're all armchair experts here. That's why we're on the podcast, right? But but it
makes sense.
I don't understand why he doesn't just take the matters into his own hands rather than keep handing it to the stewards. And especially when he always gets so annoyed at the stewards. And you know, we've seen his post-race "I'm not talking about it" stance. Well, if he overtook on circuit and kept it on circuit, we wouldn't be in this position. He wouldn't be annoyed. So he's good enough to take it to Piastri without having to worry about what the stewards think of a move.
We will talk more about his reaction because that's a whole other question. But, you know, this first corner at the Jeddah Corniche circuit was actually, we were there recently with Formula E, and it's a very tight chicane. And, you know, you can see that if you make a move and you go wrong, there is space for you to do that. You know, the corner that comes to mind where you couldn't do that is a corner of a track that we were at a few weeks ago, Donington Park. You know, one of the last ones going on to the hairpin. If you take that chicane and cut the corner, you're going over gravel, you're going to cause some serious damage to your car. Whereas obviously when it's just a kind of run off tarmac, you can do what Max Verstappen did. And you're right in saying that, because it feels like maybe, and I'll put this to you, maybe he doesn't feel confident enough that if he just relinquishes it, he can catch up with Oscar Piastri. Could that be something in this? He knows the car's not as strong. He knows his own ability, but maybe he isn't as confident as he was in previous seasons that relinquishing a corner would allow him that opportunity.
I think he potentially realised that McLaren had more pace yesterday and therefore saw his best opportunity of winning that race was leading out of turn one, and therefore thought, whatever happens, I'm leading out of turn one. And unfortunately, if you look at it from the point of view that car, so the Red Bull with Verstappen in, they're responsible for everything that happens to that car. They didn't get a good enough start. That's where it started. If he'd have got the same start that Piastri did, he would have been able to cut across the front of Piastri, defend into turn one, and then he would have controlled the lead of the race. But ultimately, he bogged down in the first phase, then got a bit of a wheel spin. There's not a long run down to turn one at Jeddah, and yet still Piastri was easily able to get all the way alongside in the braking zone. The only reason that Max Verstappen was ahead at the apex, and part of the argument that Red Bull and Verstappen are championing for, is that, I was ahead at the apex. But he only managed to get ahead at the apex by braking so late that he was never going to make turn two. So therefore, in my argument, it's appealing to the referee. You know, it's effectively similar to a dive. I think I mentioned it, a similar analogy in Japan, where Norris came out of the pits and drove onto the grass, and that was a similar situation. It was an appeal to the referee, but the only thing different was that he took a lasting advantage in this, whereas Norris didn't. A couple of weeks ago or a week ago in Japan. So, it's not good look. It's not a good look for me. I think we would rather see fights for the lead being done on circuit.
You make a good point in that he's allowing someone else to make the decision, and therefore they gave him the 5-second penalty, and he can't argue with it. And actually, he chose not to argue with it. And this is, the other talking point that's come out of this race. And that is that, and I've got a little quote from Max here saying that you can't share your opinion because it's not appreciated, apparently, or people can't handle the full truth. Honestly, it's better if I don't say too much. It's honestly just how everything is becoming. Everyone is super sensitive about everything. And what we have in the rules currently, we cannot be critical anyway. So less talking, even better for me. And obviously this is because the FIA, after the swearing and everything that happened last year, have changed their rules. And it kind of suggests that basically any swearing, obviously we've talked about that loads of times on this show, but there's also a bit on criticising decisions and criticising the FIA. So Max Verstappen is continuing what we saw a bit last year by just saying, well, I'm not going to comment on it then. And that kind of diminishes the enjoyment for fans watching, because half the enjoyment of watching what was quite a boring race in effect is watching the reaction of the drivers to see what they make of situations. And if you've got the world champion just saying, I'm not going to talk about it, then I think, from my perspective anyway, as a fan watching it very early in the morning here in the States, I kind of switched off because I was not going to hear what he had to say about it. So for me, that was the broadcast over, and it's not as enjoyable as it should be.
I'm going to say something a little bit juicy here, and I wanted to come across in the right way. This is completely born out of the fact that Max is completely selfish and also is a bad loser. I think that's fair to say. But I say that with respect to Max, because those are the traits that allow him to be so good. But it's also why we in the media and we as fans get so frustrated, because he can't take not winning. And then when he doesn't win, he throws his toys out the pram. And this is an example of that. I completely respect the fact that that's the way he's been brought up and that's the way he is. And that's what's allowed him to be so good. But I mentioned it in the previous bit that we spoke about. It's frustrating for us at home because he doesn't need to do this. He doesn't need to, as you put it, put the decision in other people's hands. He doesn't need to then sulk about it after the race. If he just raced hard, but within the rules and not, well, I said within the rules, not giving opportunities for other people to influence his race outcome, he wouldn't then be so upset about it and making an issue because, you know, he's being a little bit, in my opinion, a bit petulant. Oh no, I didn't win the race. It's everyone else's fault. Well, ultimately, he didn't say anything about the fact that his start wasn't very good. He didn't say, oh, maybe I should have dropped in behind and then overtaken him under DRS. There's a lot of finger pointing going on when ultimately some of the a large proportion of the blame lies at his feet and at Red Bull's feet, because they're the ones that put themselves in that position. He was the one that took the decision to go over the circuit limits. He was the one that then put it in the hands of the stewards. And then he's the one that then is complaining after the race. I do, to a certain extent, understand his point that sometimes the Formula One drivers at the moment feel like they can't say what they want to say. And I also understand that he's a very honest person, something I respect about him a lot. He does just say what he thinks. But when he said it a few times and he keeps getting stung by it, he's just like, well, maybe if you can't say anything nice, don't say it at all, is his policy. Again, I don't think he cares about the spectacle. He cares about him going racing and him winning races and world championships. But I don't think he fully grasps the fact that Formula One doesn't exist without everything else around it. He can't just go racing without there being TV, without there being interviews, without there being stewards. He basically wants it to be like karting when he grew up, where it's basically people just racing. It's pure racing. And that's what he likes. Formula One's never going to be that. There's a lot more to it. And who am I? I mean, again, this is coming across a bit different because who am I to say I've never raced in Formula One? I'm not even, in the Formula One paddock, so to speak. So who am I to say he needs to understand that this is what Formula One's like? But at the same time, he's been in it long enough now to know what it is like. So maybe a slight change of outlook or a slight change of approach from Verstappen would help himself, both in terms of results, because he wouldn't be putting that in the hands of other people, but also in how much he enjoys it, because he's clearly not enjoying this side of the sport at the moment. And that's a shame, because we want to see our reigning world champion enjoying going racing.
Yeah, for me, last year, we saw signs when he was coming under pressure of him, being a little bit like this and refusing to talk. And now I think, that was a half a season of him feeling under pressure. And now this is a full season of him not being in the best car. And the biggest threat to him not winning a championship for the first time since he won his first championship in 2021. Obviously, the team principals, and I say team principals, we always talk about Zach Brown as a team principal when he's not, he's a CEO. Obviously, Zach Brown is saying it's appropriate from the McLaren side of things, and Christian Horner suggesting it's harsh. But again, they didn't say too much either. So it's one of those situations now where we don't have the person that was involved talking about it. We've only got one side of the story where Piastri felt that everything was fine and that everything was kind of worked out appropriately. We don't have what Max has to say, and we're never going to get that probably. Do you think finally on this that the FIA really have kind of backed themselves into a corner by changing these rules and clamping down on the drivers so much that it really will start to bite them in the backside, really, because fans will start to ask questions and the pressure will build from that perspective? Because, as I say, the fans are not hearing from the drivers and they're not getting the juicy gossip that they want, because as much as Formula One is racing now, a lot of the new fans have come from the kind of entertainment and drama kind of side of things.
Yeah, I think the FAA have some thinking to do, both in terms of the way they're conducting themselves with the drivers and what they're placing upon them in terms of penalties and what they can and can't say, and fines and the like. And clearly the drivers aren't happy at the moment, but also the FAA needs, in my opinion, to look at the driving standards regulations and what's allowed and what's not allowed in terms of overtaking and defending, because the rules as they are at the moment leave so much up to opinion and the line in the sand they've drawn, which is like, ahead at the apex. That's so ambiguous, because we've seen this weekend Verstappen was ahead at the apex in theory. I mean, it was very, very close, but I think on balance, he was ever so slightly ahead when the apex of the corner was. But then that's not how you drive a corner. You can't just barrel into a corner as fast as you want to get to the apex first. Otherwise, it just becomes a race as who can get to the apex. That's not how it works. To complete a successful overtake, you have to beat them out of the corner as well. So I think they should look at that, because then you extend it to places like Monaco and Baku and places where it's not just a white line and tarmac, you've got a wall. Well, we're going to see people causing crashes. If you race to the apex and then wash wide in the car on your outsides, trying to race the driver on the inside to the apex, they both make it to the apex, but then they're both entering the corner too fast. The driver on the outside is inevitably going to hit the wall. And that's not a safe situation to be in. And that's not how racing should work, in my opinion. And also, I think that's the opinion shared by a lot of people, especially in racing, who have been around a long time. I think there should be at least you should at least allow for a car on your outside if they have a significant overlap. The FIA is well within their right to define what a significant overlap is, and they're well within their right to change the rules they've already mentioned and say, if the car is alongside by this much at a certain point, then you must allow them space at the exit. And I think that would promote better racing, because the precedent they're setting with race to the apex means that it doesn't really matter what happens at the exit. And therefore, if you're on the inside and you're just ahead at the apex, you can just run the car on the outside off. And therefore, that car has no opportunity to get you back at the next corner. Whereas, let's say for the thought experiment, any overlap, you must allow them some space. Then if the car's even got a front wing alongside you, you'd have to leave them space on the exit. Then we'd see racing at the next corner. But then that car on the outside could then have an overlap, and we'd see multiple corner racing. Whereas at the moment, there's an incentive to just effectively run the car on the outside off the road.
I think when you're taught to drive, and we talk to loads of drivers' coaches on this show, the corner isn't just the apex when you go into it. The corner is a process, and when you go out of you enter a corner. I'm guessing you hit an apex, then you exit the corner. It's not just the entrance that's the thing, and that's from a complete novice here. I've done some karting, and then you've seen how bad I am at karting. But yeah, for me, completing the corner is the whole thing, and that's where it should be looked at. But there we go. We've rambled on about this far too much. Let's talk about McLaren then, and Oscar Piastri, of course, taking that race win. That means it's now 3 race wins this season to Lando Norris's 1 race win. He's got a 10-point lead in the championship. He's looked calm under pressure. He's taken it to Max Verstappen. He's dealt with Max Verstappen when he's behind him. And I mean, when Lando Norris makes mistakes like he made in qualifying with that crash, which left him down in 10th on the grid, he's storming ahead and he's looking like the more solid and calm and collected driver, which in turn, if you're looking at them as very evenly matched drivers, would give you the idea that he's the favourite for the championship.
Well, he's in the lead in this race weekend. He's shown that he has all the attributes to take the championship, and when you're not making mistakes, that's what wins you championships. Unfortunately, Lando Norris is making mistakes at the moment. But I do think Lando will have a second wind at some point. I think we'll see him enter the form that he had at points last year, where he was looking almost unbeatable himself. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the season, because I think it's going to be very close, very tasty, and we've only had a slither of what's to come.
On that Lando Norris incident, obviously we've seen loads of replays. We've watched it, and he was fine, and that's the first thing we always want to see with drivers. What do you make of that? Was that someone trying too hard, knowing he is under pressure now from his teammate?
I think there's a lot of talk about it. I think it's a lot more simple than a lot of people are making out. He was just pushing to try and get a good lap. It looked like he just missed his turning point by a meter and a half maybe, which is at 100 and whatever miles an hour going into that corner. Such a small amount. And those are the margins in a circuit like the Jeddah Corniche circuit. You go a bit wide, you're off the rubber, you get a snap of oversteer, you hit the curb, and you're in the wall. I think if the situation had been reversed and Piastri had that incident, then the narrative would be different. But it's just because of what's happened recently that we're talking about. Is he under pressure? Is he pushing too hard? I think it's fueled by the fact that Norris has actually been quite critical of himself and maybe quite negative in the press as well. So he's not really helping himself. But I also really appreciate the fact that he is being so honest and open with everyone, because we get an insight into what he's actually thinking. Whereas we've already discussed this episode, we're getting the complete opposite from Max Verstappen, where he's saying effectively no comment. So it's good to see that. I think it'll take one good result or one good quali for Norris, let's say a weekend where he gets pole position, then takes the race win, and then we've got a race on for the season for the championship between him and Piastri, and who knows, Verstappen as well. The car speed will decide which whether he can get involved, but certainly Norris versus Piastri is not going to be as amicable as it has been so far. I don't think there's going to be some flashpoints.
I don't ever like to call someone cold or emotionless, but I've seen a lot of people this past weekend suggesting that while Oscar Piastri is both of those things, Lando Norris is far too emotional, and it's something where Oscar's got a better grip of that. Obviously, he's a lot less experienced in the F1 car, 2.5 seasons versus 6 seasons. What do you make of that? Because we have seen emotional moments from Lando, as you've just mentioned.
As a driver and having experienced a fair amount of ups and downs when I was racing, I don't think he potentially experiences more ups and downs than many of the other drivers. He's just a lot more open with the way he is in the media and over the radio than other drivers. I'm sure that Piastri is just as disappointed after a bad result. I'm sure after the win this weekend, he feels just as good as all the times that Norris has won. But then the other drivers don't show it as much. So therefore, as much as some people are seeing it as a weakness, to a certain extent, I agree with what Vettel's been out and said, which is, it's good to see someone actually being honest and open in the media, because it shows a lot of people that you can be that way. And I don't see it as a weakness unless he is being too hard on himself. Him showing an emotion that is natural is perfectly fine. But my only concern is that he beats himself up. I know we've discussed this before, but I've spoken to his previous driver coaches and they've said that he's very hard on himself, but that's why he's so good. And he's very critical of himself when he doesn't win and when he doesn't perform. But again, that's why he's got to the level he has. But there's also that fine line between being critical of yourself to find flaws and improve, but then also just beating yourself up and then beating yourself and your confidence down. And that's something that is not going to help his performance. But also, we've seen that Lando can absolutely switch it on and be one of the best, if not the best driver in Formula One at times. And I think we're going to see more of that this season. I hope we're going to see a lot more of that this season, because then it's going to push Oscar Piastri to his limits, because we haven't really seen that yet. We haven't seen Oscar Piastri in the fierce competition of a championship fight. We know that he can perform under race weekend pressure. We know he can perform under pressure from good drivers. We know he can lap quickly, but the pressure of a championship fight and it coming down to the last few rounds and that sort of thing, we haven't seen yet. And I'd like to see if his steely and stoic approach gets tested, because that's what we want to see, isn't it? We're here to watch sport. We're here to watch gladiators in the Formula One ring, and we want to see who comes out on top.
I don't know. I would want to watch gladiators getting into the Formula One car, because I don't really think that reboot of Gladiators has been good. But I know what you mean. I'm just kidding. Interestingly, I know someone that used to work very closely with Lando in the McLaren setup, and when he was starting out, and he would, have a bad qualifying, and he would be fairly down on himself, as you've said there, and he would take it very personally. And take, for example, when Daniel Ricciardo was there as well, he'd finished 17th in qualifying, and you'd imagine that he would also be pretty down and dejected. And the stark difference between Lando's response as a kind of young but a slightly different mentality to Daniel Ricciardo, big, happy, smiley kind of guy, whether that's just, his emotive way of dealing with it, and inside he's a little bit, more self-critical. It'd be quite interesting to see. They would tell me that, Daniel the next morning would come in all bright and happy, while Lando would still be dwelling on what had happened yesterday. And I know it's something that he's worked on massively and he's changed a lot recently, but I guess moments when you do doubt yourself or you do take things too hard can still seep through, even if you've kind of put them away and sort of worked on those kind of emotional side of things. So it's interesting to see that and hear that from someone that's worked in McLaren before. What do you make of the partnership then between Oscar Piastri and Mark Webber? A lot of people talking about this week, because obviously it's the first time an Australian has led the Formula One World Championship since Mark Webber back in the day, and they do have a really good partnership, and people are kind of calling the Australian former driver his secret weapon. What kind of things would Mark Webber be speaking to Oscar Piastri about, and what kind of advice would he be giving that would give him the edge?
I think secret weapon is potentially a good way of thinking about it, because we've got a lot of these drivers in the Formula One that have managers that manage their contractual obligations and work with the teams to set their pay and all that good stuff. But when you've got a manager in your corner that's effectively been there, done that, got the t-shirt and the scars, and can use that experience to give you the input of right, ignore this, don't worry about that, we need to concentrate on this. That sort of thing is invaluable. It's effectively like having a mentor. And Mark Webber had a fair share of both the politics of Formula One, but also the ups and downs of a championship fight. He's led the World Championship before, and I think cool stat that it's the first Australian that's led the championship since Webber, and it's his manager. But he also has been involved in sort of inter-team politics at Red Bull when he was there with Vettel. He's been involved in lots of dealings outside in terms of change teams when in his early career. But that resilience that Webber has built over his career, his long career in Formula One, and don't forget, his tagline is Aussie grit, so he's a pretty determined guy as it is. But being able to share that and mentor Piastri in this situation and allow Piastri to just perform at his best, combined with Piastri's personality, which seems pretty unfazable anyway, is turning into a bit of a nightmare combination for everyone else, because it doesn't seem like much affects him. You spoke about it just before we changed subjects, but Norris sometimes carries with him issues from the previous day. We haven't seen that from Piastri, and that's the sort of thing that you need to do as a sports person to get the most out of yourself. Is things go badly, absolutely dwell on it, analyze it, pick it apart, find out what went wrong, but then you have to come to a conclusion, box it up, and then leave it in the past and use it as fuel to push you forward, knowing that because of that, you're a better driver today than you were yesterday, rather than think to yourself, oh, I'm not good enough because I made a mistake yesterday. That's, I think, the mental difference. And from what I've seen, Piastri thinks a lot more constructively in that regard, and having someone like Webber in his corner will certainly help with that. I'm sure Norris has people like that in his corner as well, but maybe they're not as public and we haven't seen it. But the combination of Webber and Piastri, it could be a killer partnership, and who knows, it could be a multi-championship winning partnership, because if Piastri gets the championship this year and then McLaren are good in 2026 with their new car, we could be seeing a changing of the guard in Formula One and in McLaren. Who knows?
Yeah, the McLaren team will be really happy with the first place driver and the second place driver going into this week break. Before we have the Miami Grand Prix, what did you make, just before we move on, of the little moment between another manager and client situation, which was that kind of very near miss between Gabriel Bortoleto? It's kind of not seeing Fernando Alonso and maybe very, very only slightly missing him as the wall kind of got in the way, as I can't remember who it was in front of them. It was a bit of a hairy moment, and I think they were flying home together.
It's a bit of a weird situation you're racing on the same grid as your manager. I don't know how I feel about that. It's a bit like a player coach sort of situation, or player manager, I imagine, in football. I'm not the biggest football fanatic, but it just doesn't sit right with me. I feel like you've got a bit of maybe you race that person differently. In this specific incident, Bortoleto had no idea Alonso was there. And to be honest, in my opinion, I've been in Alonso's position. You see a gap and you go for it. But in hindsight, actually, that was pretty risky. And it was only a skill on Alonso's part and luck in the whole situation that one of them or both of them didn't end up out of the race. I think it would have been fairly inconsequential in terms of championship points anyway. But yeah, it's a bit of a funny one, and also quite a good story, isn't it? That there was the joking in the press that Bortoleto wasn't going to get any dinner on the flight home with Alonso.
Well, look, Alonso's not won 2 world championships by taking the safe route most of these times, and it's nice to see that, in his veteran years, he's still very much doing the same, and I guess Gabriel Bortoleto will never do that again. Let's just round off then the rest of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Ferrari. Charles Leclerc, impressive from him, really getting to grips with this car, really showing up Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton finished like 30 seconds behind him in 7th, while Charles Leclerc was on the podium. You must be impressed with what he's doing in a car that isn't the best car out there, and it probably isn't as good as Ferrari were hoping this season.
He's doing very, very well. The performance this weekend was pretty much faultless, and I think he's sort of said that himself. They maximised everything. They weren't even that far off the lead. Was it 8 seconds in the end? So that's pretty impressive for a car that they are not happy with at the moment. I think it's exaggerated by the fact that their qualifying pace, especially this weekend, was nowhere near their race pace. Their race pace has actually been pretty good at most points this season. But this weekend, very impressive for Leclerc, especially as you've mentioned, 30 seconds ahead of Hamilton. And Hamilton seemed pretty despondent in the post-race interviews. Normally, he's pretty critical, but he seemed very cup half empty. I think his words even were something along the lines of, if you look at it optimistically, then yeah, but I'm not sort of thinking about it like that. It's going to be pretty painful going forward. And it's like, to paraphrase. So yeah, that's not exactly an enthused and encouraged Hamilton.
At what stage do you think Lewis Hamilton has to maybe accept he is being a team player for this season and that Charles Leclerc is their best option for finishing higher up the standings? Because he won't have come into this season. He hasn't joined this team after all this fanfare to be second fiddle. But at some point, if he is struggling to get to grips with this car with the new regulations next year, there may be a decision that has to be made.
Sounds like Hamilton's kind of already given up, unfortunately, with the way he's talking about things going forward. He's just sort of talking about it like, I'm not going to get anywhere near Leclerc. I'm not going to be able to push on. I'm not going to do this, do that. Let's not forget that he did win the sprint race in Shanghai, and he's kind of half forgotten that, I think. So when things go right, and with the field being so close as it is at the moment, there's no reason why Ferrari couldn't have a McLaren-like resurgence in the second half of this year if they really pushed on. And if things go well for Hamilton and he's feeling confident or more confident with the car underneath, and there's no reason why he can't take it to Leclerc, as we saw in the first race at Shanghai, the sprint race in Shanghai. So he's being a bit negative on himself. It would be good to see a proper 3-car battle at the front of the field, wouldn't it? With the McLarens, the Red Bull, maybe Red Bulls, depending on how Yuki continues, and then the Ferraris. And, let's not forget that George Russell is on a pretty good run of results here at the moment, with a lot of podiums and pretty much every top 5 of this season so far. So things are shaping up pretty well if things continue to get closer and closer as they have been for the last 12, 18 months.
Yeah, of course, Mercedes didn't have a particularly good weekend, so not much for them or not much for us to talk about Mercedes in this episode. We've got a few tracks coming up where the one lap pace in qualifying will be actually quite important when you go into the race, with the likes of, Monaco coming up for obviously very soon after Miami. Does that play into the favour of Charles Leclerc because he can get a good lap out of that Ferrari?
It actually, I think, in my opinion, plays against Ferrari at the moment. They seem to be struggling with one lap pace, and one lap pace is what gets you the position on the grid. And he can race well, but there's only so much you can do at places like Monaco and Miami to a certain extent. Miami's not so bad, but that sort of middle sector, first and middle sector, you're just corner, and that's when you lose time in the race. So actually, the short term, maybe Ferrari not quite there unless they make some big changes. But then when we get into the middle of the season, where there's circuits where we can have good racing, like we've seen good racing at Spa and other circuits like that, Silverstone as well. If they can get their one lap pace at least somewhere near, then their race pace should be somewhat comparable in situations. And I'm hoping that we see a bit of a jumbling of the order, because it is so close. We even heard from Zach Brown saying that as much as they are the dominant car at the moment, everyone is effectively one upgrade away from being the best car on the grid. And when we're only 5 races into the season, it only takes one good upgrade from a team to then have a dominant second half or second 2/3 of the year. And all this that we've been talking about, McLaren walking away with it, Piastri being champion, could seem a bit old news.
Talking of upgrades, we've got to move on because we're running very quickly out of time. Let's just talk about 2 more teams. Williams, you might have seen all over their social media, they're celebrating the best start to a season in I think 8 or 9 years since 2016. Both cars finishing in the top 10. It seems like, Carlos Sainz has maybe finally got to grips with this new car, and new car to him at least, finishing ahead of Alex Albon. It's really looking positive for them at the moment.
Yeah, when have we seen both Williams in the top 10 on merit? And they were effectively the 5th best team this weekend. And it's impressive to see. I love to see it. Williams have got a lot of support. There's a lot of people wanting to see them do well. And they're working well as a team. So clearly the car's working. They've got 2 good drivers. James Vowles has sort of orchestrated that. And they're working well. They were using the DRS to make sure that they continued or held on to those points-paying positions ahead of Hadjar. So great to see. Hopefully it continues.
And finally, Yuki Tsunoda, not a great weekend for him, not finishing the race. Liam Lawson, a shout out to him. Obviously, it's probably good that he's going under the radar a little bit now, finishing 12th in the Racing Bulls. But for Yuki Tsunoda, he's had those 3 races back to back to back, very much thrown into the spotlight. His home race to start with Red Bull, that's a lot for a young driver to take in and get his head around. I know he's at Silverstone this week. He'll be doing some sim work in Milton Keynes to start with, and then he's doing some testing in a slightly older car in Milton Keynes at Silverstone this week. What kind of things will he be doing and will he be working on? Obviously, the car from a couple of years ago is very similar to the car he's driving this year.
It'll be sim work to correlate a lot of the work that the team are doing. That's less for the driver when you're on the simulator. That's more for the team. You don't learn a huge amount in terms of the driver, other than maybe the intricacies of how the car might behave at the circuit. But ultimately, until you get real wheels on real tarmac, you can't get that. But then that real car testing, previous car testing at Silverstone, I didn't know that was happening before you mentioned it, but that will be helpful for him. Nice to have a couple of weeks off of racing now. He can sort of reset, get a bit of energy back. Let's not forget these drivers travel around a lot, and you know, John, quite how tiring that can be, especially when you're driving a Formula One car. But then getting some proper testing at Silverstone, that'll be good for him to just reset, circuit he knows, in a car that he hasn't maybe driven a huge amount of the previous seasons. I was a 23 Red Bull, but it'll have a lot of similar characteristics. A circuit that's coming up, so any laps that you can get at a circuit you've got coming up is always useful. I expect to see Yuki getting closer and closer. He's actually impressed me since he's joined. He had a tricky start at Japan, but then Bahrain was pretty good. This weekend wasn't far off. Unlucky in the race, I thought. It was genuinely a racing incident in my eyes. Pierre Gasly was entitled to go around the outside, but it's just so tight there. And Yuki was doing all he could to avoid an incident, but just slight touch, and with the walls being so close, took them both out. But he was impressive, and impressed to see he's been the closest that anyone's basically been to Verstappen since probably Ricciardo.
Yeah, probably justifying that decision, and let's hope Liam Lawson can continue to get some good results, because as you've said in previous shows, he's not a bad driver. Obviously, we have a couple of weeks off then, and we have Miami, and then races come thick and fast after that. We mentioned Silverstone. We're going to be at Silverstone this coming weekend for GB3, where we'll hear more from what happens there as the new season kicks off with brand new cars and DRS for the first time in the championship on this show next week. But for now, Piers Pryor, former British F3 driver and motorsports expert, thank you very much for joining me, and I'm sure we will talk again after Miami coming up in a couple of weeks' time.